When talking about Vietnam, it's important to understand where the conflict started or originated in the first place. Vietnam was a long bloody war for the United States, but the Vietnamese were already used to conflict in their country. This would have started about 9 years before the United States even put boots on the ground. This was called the Dirty War by French leftists. This war was between the French and the Vietnamese as a sort of rebellion against the French. The first few years of the war involved low-level rural insurgencies against the French. But in 1949, the conflict turned into a conventional war between two armies. The French were armed with equipment supplied by the United States, while the Vietnamese were equipped with equipment supplied by the Soviet Union and the Chinese. An interesting part of this war was that the French were only to use their colonial troops from their colonial empire, and this also included ethnic minorities from the Vietnamese and also the French Foreign Legion. This was in order to prevent the war from falling even further out of favor with the Viet Minh using their tried and true tactics of guerrilla warfare and attacking bases at the end of long logistical trails, and the French's inability to use their lightly armored tanks due to the dense jungle forest and their lacking air force, which could have been used in carpet bombings, the French soon found that the war was losing favor. At the International Geneva Convention on July 1st, 1954, the new Social French government and the Viet Minh made an agreement which effectively gave the Viet Minh control of North Vietnam above the 17th parallel. The South would continue under Bao Dai, a French-appointed minister. The agreement was denounced by the state of Vietnam and by the United States, and a year later, Bao Dai was disposed of by his prime minister, creating the Republic of Vietnam, aka South Vietnam. Soon, the insurgency was backed by the North, developing against the Diem's government. The conflict gradually escalated into the Vietnam War, which resulted in the fall of South Vietnam and the reunification of Vietnam as a whole.
So, I'm going to be discussing the very beginning of American involvement in Vietnam. So, basically, America did not want communism to spread to South Vietnam or the rest of Asia. And what marks the very beginning involvement of America in Vietnam was on November 1st, 1955. President Eisenhower deployed military assistance to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And this was kind of the very beginning of American involvement. It wasn't the war or anything, but it was the beginning. And then later on in 1963, President Kennedy dies, and this proves to be a pretty important factor as we move on. I'll come back to that later. So then Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, and 1964 marks the official start year of the Vietnam War. The tipping point, which fully pushed us to the war, was when two U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin were fired upon. They radioed back to the U.S., and Lyndon B. Johnson decided to escalate the war and push U.S. military assistance into Vietnam. This begs the question, if Kennedy were still alive, would he have been as aggressive or would he have been more conservative? We'll never know the answer to that question because he wasn't around, but I'll leave you with the fact that President Lyndon B. Johnson really escalated the war and pushed us more into Vietnam.
We discussed in the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1968. Operation Rolling Thunder began on March 2nd, 1965, and its target was to boost morale in Saigon, destroy transportation systems, industrial base, and air defenses in North Vietnam, and halt the flow of men and equipment into South Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder was ceased in 1968 and struggled to meet its objectives due to North Vietnam being backed by the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. Over 300,000 sorties were flown by the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and the Marine Corps. 864,000 tons of bombs were dropped over this period. It is also worth noting that it was viewed by the media and American public as unethical due to civilian casualties, and the CIA estimated that 48,000 civilians were wounded or killed due to Operation Rolling Thunder. Search and destroy tactics were utilized in the Vietnam War as well, and the first major battle of the Vietnam War was between U.S. troops and North Vietnamese regulars, and it was a two-part battle between November 14th and through November 18th of 1965. The first part of this battle is depicted in the movie We Were Soldiers Once. 237 U.S. troops were killed, and between 1,037 and 1,745 NVA, North Vietnamese Army, regulars were killed. It was the first battle where soldiers were airlifted in and out of the battlefield, and the Huey was the workhorse for such operations. And this method of troop insertion would be used throughout the war. Another method of troop insertion was the Brown Water Navy. They used modified landing craft from World War II and modified commercial boats to insert troops along the Mekong River Delta, and it was a joint operation between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy. By the end of March in 1965, there were 5,000 Marines at Da Nang, although they were bolstering the already 23,000 military advisors that were already in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000 troops deployed to Vietnam, and by the end of 1968, there were 549,500, which was the peak of the deployed troops during the war. Additionally, the spending on war that year was the most at $77.4 billion, which adjusted for inflation is $603 billion in 2022 money. Casualty numbers from 1965 were 1,928, and in 1966 it was 6,350, in 1967 11,363, 1968 was 16,899. And the approval rate at the end of each year was at 1965 it was 56%, 1966 it was 42%, 1967 it was 40%, and 1968 it was roughly 41%. The Tet Offensive, that happened on the Buddhist holiday, and it started at 2:45 a.m. on January 30th, 1968, with the breaching of the seemingly impenetrable American embassy in Saigon. It was breached by Viet Cong troops. All across South Vietnam, roughly 80,000 VC came off the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Laos and Cambodia, and both were on the western border of South Vietnam. It's how the Viet Cong and NVA got around basically being attacked by the U.S. because the U.S. wouldn't do anything in Laos and Cambodia. So they would just move their troops through Laos and Cambodia unopposed. They attacked major cities and bases all across Vietnam, and they could just insert directly off the Ho Chi Minh Trail into these cities and into South Vietnam, where it was just path of least resistance, basically. The Tet Offensive was strategically a win for the U.S., but it was a massive hit to the troop and American public morale, with approval rate of the Vietnam War plummeting to 32%. It also led to an increase in fragging amongst U.S. soldiers, which was officers being murdered by their own troops. When Tet soldiers returned to the United States, the response to their return was often hostile. After Tet, General Westmoreland, who was the Allied commander in Vietnam at this time, requested 200,000 additional troops, but his request was denied. Moving on to the draft. The draft went from 1964 to 1973 and was largely resented among college students. Average age of a troop in Vietnam was 19, which was 7 years younger than the average age in World War II. All males from age 18 to 26 were required to register for the draft. Also, students were upset that at 18 they could die for their country, but they couldn't vote or buy/drink alcohol. This criticism led to the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And due to draft deferments being granted to college students, the less affluent individuals made the vast majority of combat troops. The individuals drafted who had higher levels of education were often given military office jobs. Roughly 80% of the combat troops came from lower classes. Latino and African Americans were assigned to combat roles more regularly than the drafted white Americans. At first, draft dodgers were seen as cowards, but as the conflict drew on, the public was more sympathetic. Notable draft dodgers are Ted Nugent, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Rush Limbaugh, Bruce Springsteen, Muhammad Ali, George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney. Moving on to the television impact. At the beginning of the war, anti-war protests were few at first, with the media having a big presence on the ground in Vietnam, combined with the Johnson administration's commitment to escalation. Television changed the public mind. On the nightly news in the U.S., millions saw body bags leaving rice paddies and jungles. In August 1968, the peaceful protests turned violent as the Doves, who were individuals who were anti-war, Hawks were pro-war. They clashed with police and National Guard at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. They wanted to prevent a nomination of a pro-war candidate. When Nixon was inaugurated in January of 1969, the nation was split, and the number of anti-war Doves increased, with a vast amount of the silent majority of Hawks still supporting the war. Many admitted that involvement was a mistake, but defeat was unthinkable. And that's a brief synopsis of the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1968.
President Nixon took office in January of 1969. He knew that the success of his presidency depended on ending this war in an honorable way. His expectation was that the American people would give him about a year to end the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. He expected to succeed. Within months, Nixon directed the military to up pressure on the battlefield, all while ordering B-52 bombings on Vietnamese camps in Cambodia. This would be known as the menu bombings, to try and show his willingness to escalate war efforts. While upping the pressure, Nixon began to try to negotiate with the Soviet Union, trying to get them to convince North Korea to negotiate with us, being the U.S. In the meantime, to buy some time from the American people, Nixon began to pull troops out of Vietnam. On June 8, 1969, Nixon met with South Vietnam President Nguyen Van Thieu on Midway Island to announce the very first redeployment of troops, and from that point on, the withdrawal of troops never stopped. The U.S. began to try and negotiate with North Vietnam to find a way to end U.S. involvement in the war. However, these negotiations were not going the way Nixon wanted them to. In fall of 1969, Nixon was planning on attempting a delivery of short, sharp blows via air and naval forces. However, American casualties were on the decline, the anti-war movement was still a powerful force, and there was no satisfactory military solution in sight, so Nixon decided against it and delivered his silent majority speech on November 3rd, 1963. In March of 1970, the Prince of Cambodia fell, and this triggered a U.S. South Vietnamese push into Cambodia. This then triggered many violent protests across the country in the U.S., resulting in the death of 4 students at Kent State University. However, this push into North Vietnamese territory led to a great yield of rice, weapons, and ammunition, as well as disrupted the North Vietnam military for months, allowing the U.S. more time to pull troops out of Vietnam. Around February of 1971, Nixon began to reshape the international context of the war by building relationships with North Vietnamese allies in Moscow and Beijing in an attempt to try and create a dilemma for the Soviet Union and China and make them decide between a better relation with the U.S. versus supporting Vietnam. However, this attempt failed, and the Soviet and China both continued to support Vietnam. In October of 1972, there was an attempt at a peace settlement, and they were trying to settle before the presidential election would occur in November. However, South Vietnam would not accept a settlement that involved North Vietnamese troops staying in South Vietnam. On December 14th, Nixon ordered massive B-52 attacks on North Vietnam, known as the Christmas bombings, in an attempt to put more pressure on South Vietnam to come with a peace settlement. Finally, on January 27th, 1973, a peace agreement was signed after the U.S. threatened to cut off all economic support to South Vietnam if they do not accept the agreement. The settlement allowed the U.S. to pull all troops out of Vietnam, and all prisoners of war were sent back to the U.S. Nixon was able to negotiate a peace agreement by stating that if the North violates any agreement or any terms of the agreement, then the U.S. will react heavily. However, this couldn't be upheld due to congressional and domestic resistance to re-engage in the war, as well as economic constraints and the Watergate crisis, which both weakened Nixon's presidency. North Vietnam triggered a major offensive on April 30th, 1975, and they rolled right into the presidential palace in Saigon, effectively ending the war in Vietnam.